So today's discussion question is, why does it take so long to be able to install Unix or Linux on brand new hardware? And what prevents it from being able to be installed out of the gate? Well, what you have to remember is whenever you are dealing with Unix or Linux, these are open source systems. Now, sometimes a manufacturer will write the drivers necessary for their hardware to function and then provide that to the community, and the community may need to do some tweaking to get it to work correctly, or they may need to do no tweaking and it works straight out of the box. And I have seen this with plenty of devices, but sometimes it takes time. The manufacturer may focus all of their efforts on creating Windows drivers and making sure that everything works under Microsoft Windows, or they may even potentially do a little tiny bit of work to make it work under Mac or something similar. But generally, they're going to focus on the Windows market, and then uh, Linux becomes an afterthought or a secondary item. Now, we're also starting to see this change. Certain technologies have brought a change into how drivers are developed and how systems are developed. So, video cards. Whenever I first started with Linux, I started with Linux back when the NVIDIA drivers, you had to download those from NVIDIA and then create a custom kernel. So NVIDIA actually would give you the drivers for their hardware, but there was no integration into your hardware automatically. You would download the drivers and then you would download a copy of the kernel source and then you would put everything together and then you would run make and make config and so on and so forth until eventually you had a fully functional kernel that you meshed into the system, and then you would type in GLX gears, and if you went from seeing 60 frames per second to something like 6,000 frames per second, then you knew you had graphics acceleration, and at that point you could play Tux Kart. That was a long time ago. Times have changed. We have things like Proton. You can go out and you can purchase a AMD or NVIDIA graphics card. You can put that into a system today. You can install Ubuntu Linux or Manjaro or whatever it is that you decide that you want to run, and you're going to have a fully functional system that's going to be able to play sometimes AAA titles right out of the box. So, what I would say is some of this has changed in that times today are much better than they were 10, 15 years ago. When I was working on Linux systems 30 years ago, 30, 20, 25, 25-ish years ago, when I was working with Linux-based systems, 20, 25 years ago, somewhere around there, um, like I said, you had to take the drivers that would come from NVIDIA. There was only a handful of graphics cards that actually worked. You had to do research and find out, okay, which graphics card can I use? Which one's compatible with the application or game that I want to be able to play? I have to create a kernel, and I remember building the kernel, and it took all night. I would literally start building the kernel when I would get home from middle school, and I would sit down at my computer and I'd start that make config and so on and so forth, and then I would go and I would have dinner and I would watch television and I would spend my evening doing all kinds of other stuff, and then I would check on it just before bed to make sure that it didn't fail yet, and then I would go to bed. And in the morning, if I had done everything correctly and I had all of the supporting software installed, I would wake up with a brand new kernel, and then I could start the process of putting the kernel into the system and maybe get all that done before I had to go to school, or else I had left all my notes out on the keyboard and I'd go to school, and then when I would get home, I would finish, right? Completely different world today. Uh, it's just not like that. So, some cutting edge hardware, it's going to work straight out of the box. They're going to release the hardware. Everything's going to already be within the latest kernel, and you're going to be able to go in and you're going to be able to run that latest kernel and the latest hardware, and it's going to be completely fine. And then some hardware, it just doesn't work. I have a video camera and microphone combination that was a fantastic piece of kit for making podcasts, and it worked great. And then one day they did a kernel update and it just stopped working. I completely just couldn't use it anymore. I talked to people on the kernel dev list. I spoke to people all over the place. And essentially, when I went to the manufacturer and I told them, hey, this thing isn't working anymore, I would love for it to continue working. What can we do? They told me, we're not going to help you. We don't care if you're not using Windows. Obviously, that you're going to break the hardware is the way that they essentially explained it to me. So you still have companies that live in this like dark ages where if you're a Linux user, you're some kind of like cretin or evil person that's out there to ruin their business. And then sometimes you have companies like AMD or Nvidia or some of these other places where they go out of their way to create the drivers necessary for you to be able to accomplish your mission. Everything kind of works nearly instantaneous or within a few days of release of the item. You may have a few problems for a short while, but they will work on those things and they'll fix them. And the amount of support that you get is incredibly good. So sometimes it's difficult to get that support, to get somebody to do the kernel development, to write the drivers, to do whatever it is that they need to do to make that hardware function. That is the difficulty in deploying an operating system on new hardware. That is the problem that you will run into. Is there support for that hardware? Does somebody own the hardware? And I've seen that as well. You can actually run NetBSD, which is another Unix-based operating system, on the Sega Dreamcast. So if you remember, the Sega Dreamcast came out in America in 1999, 1999. I'll never forget that date. I was there. On that date, you could buy the Sega Dreamcast here within the United States. Then they started porting NetBSD to the system whenever they realized that you could play a CD-ROM within the Sega Dreamcast, and then you had access to NetBSD. And then there were posts from developers who said, hey, I've written this driver, I've worked on this code. If somebody buys me a Sega Dreamcast, I will continue working on this. One of my big dreams is to get enough money that I can start sponsoring the Sega Dreamcast development for NetBSD and turn that into a project where I can start to ask for them to work on stuff. But I digress. The point here is there was a whole bunch of people who were devs who could work on the hardware for that OS, but they couldn't because they didn't own the hardware because of the cost. And that is another thing that you will run into. There are plenty of developers out there. There are more developers out there than there are individuals who own the hardware usually, right? So one of the things that you also have to remember is to get one of those developers to work on that thing, it needs to be worth their time. They need to have a reason to do it. So for something like the Sega Dreamcast, somebody goes out and they buy a Sega Dreamcast and then they do it as a labor of love. They write NetBSD for it, knowing that the people who are going to play with that are hobbyists, not necessarily somebody who's doing it for business, right? But don't forget all the hubbub and fear when Saddam Hussein went out and bought a whole bunch of PlayStation 2s because they thought he was going to use those for Scud missiles or whatever. And there was developers who were trying to figure out how you use the PlayStation 2 CPUs and things like that in order to run a missile or a rocket or something like that, and the targeting computer related to that. So, anyways, the difficulty related to deploying an operating system on new hardware is, can you get the hardware into the hands of the developers? If you're going to do it through the open source community, who's going to bankroll that and who's going to get them the money that they need so they can spend the time to work on that? Or are you going to get the hardware support from the company? So if you have a different idea of why sometimes it can be difficult to find developers to work on brand new hardware, let me know. I'd love to hear what your opinion is on some of the difficulties that we face today with not being able to install Unix or Linux on brand new hardware successfully, and sometimes having to wait for somebody to be able to write all of the code necessary to make those systems work. Looking forward to hearing from you. You all have a great one.